We are going to discuss phenomenology in general, and today we will focus on Edmund Husserl's phenomenology because it is only after Husserl phenomenology began to be well known, it became popularized in the intellectual circles. Now, when we speak about the term phenomenology, oftentimes there is some sort of confusion about the use of the term. Now, partly because people have used this term in very many different meanings. For example, Kant, he made a famous distinction between noumenon and phenomenon. Now, noumenon would mean, I shall type that particular word perhaps if it is not very familiar. I mean, we are not often using that word anyways. So Kant made a distinction in terms of noumenon and phenomenon. Okay, I have put a word there. Now, when Kant makes this distinction, what he implies is things in themselves, the essential characteristics of things, he would consider as noumenon. Phenomenon is things as they appear to me, appear to us. So that would be phenomenon. Now, Kant would say, as part of his theory of knowledge, his epistemology, that we will never be able to know the noumenon, what things are in themselves. It will be impossible for us to get to know them. What we can know is things as they appear to us. Now, when Kant speaks things as they appear to us, Kant is merely talking in terms of what we can get to know through our external senses. Of course, it is mediated by mind and so on and so forth. He speaks about the structure of mind, but basically the information is provided to you by the way in which you see, the way in which you touch it, the way in which you smell it, or whatever it is. All those external senses are involved in this. That is what is phenomena. The plural of that is phenomena. See, oftentimes in ordinary English language we do use this phenomenon. What are we trying to say? The way it appears to me, a particular event, a particular thing, and that's what we call it. That's very Kantian in that sense. Now, for Husserl, he does not use the term phenomenon or phenomenology in the Kantian sense of the term. Phenomenon for him is what is given. In other words, what is given is the essence itself. In fact, he doesn't buy the distinction that Kant makes. Now, there is nothing behind this phenomena as noumenon for Husserl. So there is only one thing, that is phenomena. So what is this phenomenology? Phenomenology is a particular approach by which you try to understand this phenomenon or phenomena. It is a method of clarification. Clarification, again, not in the ordinary use of the term clarifying. When you clarify means you begin to understand in that sense. Now, one of the problems philosophy generally had is a kind of an extreme position of subjective and objective. We are all familiar with those terminologies in any case. Whether knowledge that we have is a very subjective knowledge. In other words, is it because I, who happen to understand in a particular way, I would understand it differently because the understanding depends on each subject. The subject is the one who is trying to understand. So you as a subject would completely understand very differently. So there is nothing in the reality which is objective, independent of the individual subjects to try and understand. So this is one position, that is called subjective position. There are others who would say, well, knowledge by very definition has to be objective. There cannot be any subjective traits. Of course, we know that, how problematic this position can be. At the same time, it is also equally problematic when it is subjective. I mean, these things have been going on. In fact, some people would say that whole of epistemology or the history of philosophy of knowledge is a pendulum that swings between the subjective and objective position. Some will come and say, well, it is subjective. Others will come and say it is objective. They will give all their arguments and so on. Now, Husserl tries to somehow reconcile these extremes, these subjective and objective. So therefore, it is a methodological attempt. The attempt is to somehow reach the phenomenon, to know the phenomenon, to understand the phenomenon, but in a particular way that particular way is an investigation of your own subjective consciousness alongside the objective content. The objective content is what, the object that lies outside of you, that is the content that provides you the content. But the content by in itself, it doesn't make sense. You have to look at your subjective consciousness as well, the way in which it relates to that objective content. So phenomenology is basically a kind of a methodological approach in understanding that phenomenon. Now, and Edmund Husserl is credited for having come up with this kind of understanding, very different from his predecessors who thought of phenomenon in a very, very different way, like Kant, which of course like Hegel also takes up, and so on. Now, a brief word about Husserl himself. He was born in Austria at that time, but now it is part of Czechoslovakia. And Husserl was born of Jewish parents, born 1859, and he died in 1938. So he did not live long to see all the atrocities that the National Socialist Party in Germany could do at that time in Europe, not only in Germany but also in Europe as well. Most of his studies were either in Austria, or in Germany as well. He did some studies in Berlin, also in Vienna, and so on. He is a versatile personality in the sense that he did not begin his career with philosophy. In fact, he began his career, his academic venture, primarily as a mathematician. So he was in fact trained under leading mathematicians very rigorously, and he had, in fact, his PhD was on the theory of calculus of variations, particularly its contribution. So you can understand how rigorously he was trained in mathematics so as to do even his PhD in calculus. Only it is much later, obviously because of his background in mathematics, his own understanding or his own attempt to understand reality was very logical, and then he published his logical investigations. And it is not at the time he has discovered this idea of phenomenology and so on. It was much later. It was only at the turn of 20th century he first published the idea of phenomenology, or it is, it has two ideas, one idea, two, it is published in English anyways. It is at that time he was professor in the University of Freiburg, and then later he also published another important work, Cartesian Meditations. That is where the phenomenology comes. If you want to read something about phenomenology in the best, then that is probably what you should read. People say that he had many unpublished material. He had manuscripts, but then he destroyed most of them because of the fear of Nazis. Nazis were already taking control at that time. In his towards the end of the turn of end of 30s and so on. So therefore he also shifted to Leuven, and that is where whatever survived unpublished material were preserved, and it exists even today in Leuven, in Belgium, the archives of Husserl. So if anybody wants to study in deep Husserl, they normally go there and try to understand. Scholars normally therefore divide his intellectual career into three kinds of period: the pre-phenomenological period, and the phenomenological period, and the post-phenomenological period. Now, in the pre-phenomenological period, obviously, his understanding was very different with regard to knowledge. Being a mathematician, obviously, you can understand, his emphasis was on the question of objectivity. Knowledge is subjective, and that is partly because, mathematically speaking, people, whether you accept it or not, there are certain mathematical propositions, they are objective. So you cannot, you may not know it, you may not see it that way, but that is how it is. Therefore, there is a whole question of the subjective aspect has been neglected. It was only at that time he came across, during this pre-phenomenological period, as a little bit of background information, he encountered the famous Brentano. In fact, Brentano is a kind of a psychologist and a philosopher in some way. Basically, is a psychologist in that sense. But then he already had this approach of phenomenology in his psychological investigation. In fact, Brentano gave a psychological foundation to the concept of number. In other words, numbers have an intentional, or numbers are intentional in some way for him. Now I will explain this question of intentionality in a moment. So, in any case, Husserl was very much fascinated by Brentano's idea. Then he came up with creating a philosophy of arithmetic. It was criticized by some of the analytic thinkers, mostly by Frege at that time. And eventually Husserl slowly moved on from that position a little bit. In any case, there is a certain effect of the psychologism of Brentano in that period for him. So, now this is in general some background. Now what is important for us is this phenomenological period, because we are going to focus on the phenomenology itself as a method of investigation. Now it is at this period he tried to attempted a reconciliation, at least, between the question of subject and object in the theory of knowledge. Now there is he realized there is a need for such reconciliation, because on the one hand, what we are talking about is about the objects, but we are not talking about the objects, means that which lies outside of me. In that sense, even people could include it in that, not in the ordinary sense of the term objects. People we don't treat as objects, but objects means independent of the subject, in that sense, that which is outside of me, outside of my realm. But I am not talking about what lies outside of me in the somehow in the void. I am talking about what lies outside of me as they are given to my consciousness. And that is where he thought the concept of intentionality, which he borrowed from Brentano, would help him to bring about this reconciliation. On the one hand, the objects that I am trying to understand, no, it lies outside of me, but I am not just speaking about object as they are, that's not a question, but then as they are given to me in my consciousness. Therefore, he would come up with what is known as intentionality of consciousness. Husserl would say, well, there is a correlation between the objective content which lies outside of me and the subjective act, the act in which that my consciousness is directed to that objective content, and that is why this correlation exists. We cannot separate one from the other. So separating one from the other, somehow ignoring this correlate or correlation would lead to some kind of artificial abstraction. Husserl calls this technically, he uses Greek terms to name them. This subjective act of knowing, he would call it as noesis. Now, I think I shall type that word, since that is not something that we commonly use. And the objective act of, the objective content rather, to which the subjective act correlates, he calls this noema. So oftentimes this is called as the noesis or noematic correlation, or the noesis-noema correlation. And now these are only words, but then the point is, the one is the subjective act, another is the objective content. Now, how do you get to reconcile the objectivity of truth with the subjectivity of your knowing, your act of knowledge? Now, intentionality therefore would imply that the act of consciousness that we have, all of us have a consciousness. It is through the consciousness we try to know something. Obviously, you can immediately understand the question of psychology that comes in here the moment he speaks about consciousness. Obviously, it also implies there are certain things that could be unconscious, but knowing of always happens in a conscious way, not in an unconscious way. Unconsciously, you may kind of imbibe many things, but that is not something that you are aware of. What makes knowledge is what you are conscious of. Knowledge is that you know what you know. So that would be the understanding of knowledge. Not that everything that is buried deep within your unconscious. Of course, psychologists would come up with that kind of thinking. Now, this act of consciousness that he speaks about it is directed in a particular way to an object. Now, the intentionality, therefore, is the directedness, the way in which the consciousness of the subject is directed to the object. Therefore, there is an intentional relation between the subjective act and the objective content. So, the knowledge is gained the way in which your consciousness is directed in a particular way towards the objective content. So, therefore, intentionality as directedness to an object can be understood in terms of our everyday use of language. For example, when I say I am conscious, I am not just saying I am conscious. I am not merely affirming the fact of my subjective ability to be conscious, but then it is always I am conscious of something. Meaning to say, I am also affirming the fact of the content of what I am conscious of. Now, this is not only with regard to knowledge, by the way. It can also be with regard to our emotions in some way. For example, if I like something, I have a desire for something. So it's not merely you are affirming that the desire you have, but about what or for what. So it is inevitable. It is already in relation to this. Okay. So obviously now the focus is on the consciousness, not so much on the emotional part of it. So therefore, he would say that Descartes' affirmation that I think is incomplete unless otherwise it is related to what you think of. So you cannot just begin to affirm by saying I think. No, it has to be always I think of something. I think about something. So I think the cogito or the cogito, which Descartes affirms, is related to, I'm sure you are familiar with the term cogito that you might have heard in different contexts, but that is related to what he calls cogitatum, to what, on what you think, or of what you think. So the cogito is always in relation to what he calls the cogitatum. Now Husserl tries to explain this idea of intentionality by bringing out 4 characteristics of this intentionality. The first thing is intentionality objectivates. Now let me type that as well. Let us try and understand what he means by intentionality objectivates. Now, the intentional act is directed to the full object as its correlate. For example, when I give thought to my girlfriend, it's an example, it's not that I have a girlfriend or anything. When I give a thought to my girlfriend, it is the whole person of my girlfriend that I am giving thought to, not a fragmentary perspectival aspect. Well, I might see her from different perspectives in terms of how kind she is, how joyful she is, whatever, there are different perspectives I could think of. But when I give a thought to my girlfriend, it is the whole of the person I am giving thought to. It is not merely the fragmentary aspects that I give thought to. Now that is important. So intentionality objectivates means basically your intentionality, your intentional act, your consciousness is directed to the full object. Now again, to clarify, when I say object, it doesn't mean in the everyday ordinary use of the language, like reducing someone to an object. Object means object of my knowledge, object of my, in that sense. It could be a person, it could be a thing, it could be anything. Okay, so I'm giving, in this case, of course, the example I gave is a person. It is to the entirety of the person. It is a whole person that I give thought to. That is the first characteristic of intentionality. The second characteristic is intentionality identifies. Now, what is this? When we speak about identifies, what are we trying to say is intentionality gives a synthetic function, looking in a synthetic way, not in different aspects of it. But what does it imply here? I am looking at the identical core of the person. Now, to give another example, when I look at a flower, the flower could be an object of desire for me, an object of joy for me, object of satisfaction, whatever it is, but it is not that function that it serves that I am looking at, or I am not giving thought to that. I am giving thought to its very identity as a flower. That's the core of it. All the functions that it serves, fine, but that's not what it makes it a core, the identical core. Therefore, it is that to that particular referent. All other things are the various data that are assigned to this referent called flower, but I am giving thought to this identical core of that particular thing. That is why intentionality identifies. Now, he uses these terms in a very different way. Obviously, the words used are in German. Of course, when you translate in English, a certain amount of impoverishment is to be expected. The third characteristic of intentionality is intentionality connects. Now, how does it connect? The object that the object, the thing, or the person, for example, I give thought to, is also somehow, it also enables me to have a thought of the related aspects. Okay, the connectivity comes there. Now, it's much easier for us to give something from a point of view of seeing rather than thinking here as an example to understand. Let us see, for example, you have this famous emblem, no? The Indian emblem. What is the Indian emblem, by the way? Anybody knows that? The pillar of Ashoka. What is it?
The statue of the three-headed lion?
Yeah, actually it is four-headed lion. That's why I asked it. Okay, it is a four-headed lion. Okay, so you should remember that. But what you see is probably only the three. Head of the lion, the front, the lateral, and so on. But you are able to also connect to the rear of it, the back of it. So it is not what you see. Of course, here it is, the example is from the empirical point of view so that you can understand what it is. But when you think again, very difficult to use this imagery of seeing to thinking. When thinking, it's very clear, you only have a perception of what is in front and what is on the side, not so much on what is on behind, but you are able to connect. For example, when you look at a person, you see the face, but then you are able to, you don't see the back, but you are able to connect to that. That's the idea. But in the empirical way, it is very easy. In the question, when the matter of seeing, it is very easy to understand. But thinking happens that way. Thinking is able to give connection to the related aspects of that particular object to which you give thought. Okay. The fourth characteristic is intentionality constitutes. Now, what does that mean? Constitutes. In fact, he is using this term in a very, very specific meaning, that there is an originality of that object that emerges in your act of consciousness. Now, in other words, the object is constituted in your consciousness in the very act of consciousness. So it is not something that is already known to you, It is something already given to you. It already exists, independent of that, but somehow it gets constituted in the act of consciousness. Now, the example one can think of is, for example, you get frightened when you see a snake, especially if it is a big cobra. Obviously, you get frightened. Now, the snake as something to be, frightened about, as fearsome, is constituted in your experience of fearing. It is not in that snake itself. It is not something given. It is in the experience of fearing, the snake emerges as fearsome. Now, this is very, very, very important aspect, this idea of constituting the meaning in your consciousness. Not only just the meaning, but the very object gets constituted in your consciousness, is very specific of phenomenology. Unlike the traditional theories of knowledge, which would, for example, would normally make this understanding, any theory of knowledge, if you look at, would think about there is a subject which knows, there is an object which is known, and through a process of knowing, the subject would know the object. Now, notice that object to be known, as though the object to be known contains within itself all the essence, if you use a philosophical jargon, that you could know. So here, the knowledge is, what you know is not simply already in the object itself. What you know emerges in this relation, in the relation of how that experience of interacting with that particular object evokes certain thing within you, and that creates, that the object gets constituted in the act of consciousness. Now, we can immediately see how Brentano's idea of that psychology plays a role here to some extent. Reinstating this subjective aspect of our experience becomes very powerful. But it is not merely simply a matter of, it's only a subjective thing. No, the snake is fearsome, but that is constituted in my experience, my consciousness as part of my experience. I think my electricity failed. I am on backup, but doesn't matter. I hope, in case suddenly if I go off, realize that my electricity is off, but I will try to come with it later. Right now it is going on backup. Good. Now, these are the 4 characteristics. Once again, let me repeat. These words are very technical in a certain way, but then if you get the meaning, it's not that difficult. Intentionality objectivates. In other words, it is directed to the full object. So that's what it means, objectivates. The example I give, when I give thought to my girlfriend, I am not thinking about the individual aspects of my girlfriend, whether how kind she is, how helpful she is, and so on and so forth. But I am giving thought to the entire person as a whole. That's what it means by objectivates here. Intentionality identifies, irrespective of the different functions a particular thing can fulfill for me. For example, it can fulfill it can satisfy my desire, it can fulfill my give happiness to me, or whatever it is. But what I am trying to look at the identical core, its identity as something. So I gave the example of flower here. I also spoke about how intentionality connects. Of course, the example here was easy for us from the point of view of empirical dimension, what you see. For example, I gave the example of the Indian emblem. You can still connect to the 4th head. You don't see it. So there is a way in which the related aspect can be connected. And the 4th idea I said is how intentionality constitutes. This is one of the most important things, because the object gets constituted in your act of consciousness. Okay, the example is the snake as fearsome is constituted in your experience of fearing the snake. So the fear is not uniquely subjective thing. It is not merely, it's your imagination. No, it is not uniquely reduced to the object, that it is capable of producing fear. No, it happens at the same time. It happens at the simultaneously. Good. Now, what would be the essence of reality? One of the claims that Husserl makes is the purpose of phenomenology is to get to know the essence of reality, to get to know the things in themselves in its essence. Now, what do natural sciences deal with? Natural sciences deal with facts. Now, basically, it means that everything is, every individual thing is contingent, because essentially it could be other than what it is. It need not be this way, but it happened to be this way. That's what it means by contingence. And you are familiar with the term contingent, isn't it? It need not be that way. We make a distinction between what is necessary and what is contingent. For example, an example of contingency would be contingent truth. For example, people would say that Modi is the Prime Minister of India is a contingent truth, meaning to say it need not be that case. If the voting results were different, it could have been. It is still true, remember, but it is not something a necessary truth. Most of the truths that we deal with are contingent truths. Very few things we can ever think of as necessary truths, but otherwise most of the things, like for example, there was a heavy thunderstorm yesterday. It is true, it is factual, but it is contingent. It is not that it could have been otherwise. There could have been conditions in the weather that did not lead to this thunderstorm in Pune. So, but it happened that way. It is true, but it is only contingent, not necessary. Therefore, every individual being is contingent. In other words, its essence can be something other than what it is. So, now, to come to the knowledge of essences, therefore, when we speak about essence, to come to know the essence of it, we need to distinguish, according to Husserl, between what he calls the ordinary experience that we have and what he calls the transcendental experience. Now, sometimes in English translation you also come across the word intuition for that. Again, the term intuition can be very misleading because it is used in different contexts and different meanings. But be that as it may, it's very important for us to try to understand this distinction. What is an ordinary experience and what is a transcendental experience? Ordinary experience gives us facts. Now, phenomenology is not interested by the facts, which our natural sciences would give. Natural science and the social sciences very often somehow take this model of natural science when it comes to fact. Now, he is not saying facts are not important. He is not dismissing that. Let us not get him wrong. All that he is saying is phenomenologist's task is not that. The task of phenomenology is to get to know the transcendental experience. In other words, I must get to intuit the essence of something. It is not about what is given as fact. Fact is something that is what is on the outer layer. But beneath that fact, I must be able to get to the essential. And oftentimes, you should try and keep away this, as a method, this ordinary experience in order that you could get into the transcendental experience. Now, I will give you a simple example. This is shared to me by my sister some years ago when she was a professor of a college, where factually, she was right, there was a student who would sleep in her class invariably. Poor guy, for whatever reason. Now, this is a fact. Now, this is something that, it's an ordinary experience that you notice that, you know that from your everyday experience of that student in the class. And from that fact, you would have an ordinary judgment saying that this guy is just sleeping in the class, wasting his time. Then you can go on drawing inferences from there. Therefore, he is not motivated, he is not committed. Very often people make such mistakes. From one fact, we think we derive many facts, but then what we are doing is only inferences. The ordinary experience somehow prevents you from get to know the essence of the person. Now you see my point. My sister told me until she realized this is a fatherless boy and mother is very seriously sick, and this is also again fact, but it is not from the fact, but somehow my sister could, I mean, she said at a later time I could have an experience of that boy, that which is very different from factually what happens in the class. He had to simply, work at night in some whatever place he was working, and to make money for his studies and for his livelihood, and therefore, it's likely that he does that. Now, the essence of the person could have been lost if she remained only to the fact that was available to her. Though the other side is also a fact, I mean, that he is fatherless and so on and so forth. But even having known those facts, you can only remain at a level of fact. But the essence of the person is you are able to go only when these factual things that you witness is not taking the hold of you. This intuiting of essence is what phenomenology tries to do. It is directed to the essential without referring to the factual aspects. Factual aspects can be very, very, of course, now again, don't take Husserl out of context, then it would be very problematic, because if you say facts are not to be, you cannot have reference to the facts, though it means as though you can be simply into kind of some kind of figment of speculation. Now, Husserl is not suggesting that. Or when it comes to a kind of socio-historical analysis, this would become very inconvenient in a way, Husserl is not referring to that. He is referring to the individual things, whether it is objects or persons. If you get stuck at the factual level, you would never get to know the essence of it, the deeper dimension of it. Now, that's the point he's trying to say. Now, that he calls as a transcendental experience. Now, Husserl would say, in order to get to this transcendental experience, you need to have what is known as imaginative variation and inductive generalization. Now, inductive generalization is not very typically phenomenological, though he makes use of this term. But the inductive generalization, you all know that, you might have studied in logic, the question of induction from particular to general, right? You have an experience of particular thing, then you can kind of correlate them and say, well, if I experience of this drop of water as 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 molecule of oxygen, then this and so many drops of water, if that is the experience, I can make an inductive generalization. It's not typically phenomenological, okay? Now, imaginative variation is rather phenomenological. Now, what is this imaginative variation? If you want to understand this imaginative variation, you should somehow have this idea of what we talk about, the horizon. Now, again, it's a commonly word used in English, the horizon. You see, a horizon is a limit within which you perceive things. Something can be understood only within the horizon of possible knowledge, of possible apprehension. But the essential extends beyond the limits of actual perception. When I look at, for example, from outside my window, I have a horizon. I could see only to that limit. I cannot see beyond that. But then, what enables me somehow to get beyond that limits of actual perception is this imaginative variation. I can move beyond the limitation of this actual experience, of the limit which I perceive within that horizon, to the indeterminacy of what can be experienced. Sorry. There is something beyond that. I can at least, there can be an imaginative variation of this. Now, the horizon of what can be experienced, this is what what can be experienced, is the objective correlate of my subjective nature, of subjective dimension of what I can experience. what I can experience is not only my actualized capacity, but there is also an unactualized capacity. What I can experience is definitely can go beyond that. So, by this process, Husserl's phenomenology claims to attain an essential insight into what he calls a pure eidetic sphere. Now, again, it's a big term. Okay, pure eidetic sphere. Eidos means idea. Now, in this context, it has to be understood not so much in terms of the idea, but about the essence. Okay, the essential kind of aspect, which is not available within this limit of horizon that I have. So Husserl, says that the act of grasping the essence, therefore, has two aspects. Very good. I think the electricity came. That's a good news. The act of grasping the essence has two aspects. One is the positive aspect. The other is the negative aspect. He calls this positive aspect eidetic reduction. Now, again, the word reduction is very misleading. Oftentimes, this terms. Sorry, eidetic, not identic. He calls this eidetic reduction. Now, what is eidetic reduction? Eidetic reduction basically is the way in which we can penetrate into the essential, gradually revealing subjectivity as the source of all objectivity. Now, let us try and understand it a little more carefully. Husserl distinguishes between two types of reductions. One is eidetic and the other one is transcendental. Eidetic reduction basically means the reduction of, now reduction doesn't mean here, something, reducing something to something, but you have to understand more as a deriving something. Reduction of the essence from the fact. You can reduce or you can derive the essence from the fact. That would be considered as eidetic reduction. That is why it is a positive aspect. From the fact, you can somehow derive the essence. So that is called eidetic. The eidetic here refers more to the essence rather than idea. Not an abstraction, but what lies behind the fact. So, eidetic reduction refers to the reduction of essence from the fact. The transcendental reduction is, is the reduction of the real, the existing thing from the non-real, the non-existing thing. Now, sometimes Husserl uses them, in a synonymous way. Sometimes uses both eidetic and reduction as though they mean the same, but there is a minor difference there. Now, reduction to the essence is therefore to be understood as the constitution of the objectivity in and by my subjectivity. The objectivity is transcendentally related to my subjectivity through intentionality. So that is what the meaning of this eidetic reduction. Therefore, it is not merely the question of fact, as though the facts are just there, outside of you. You only just get to see that. It is not that kind of an understanding. You get beneath that, you look at the essence of that. And this is basically means that the objectivity gets constituted in my subjectivity, but also by my subjectivity. And there is a transcendental relation between the subjectivity and objectivity through this intentionality. During question answer, I will come back to that with some examples that may be clear. In this negative aspect, the first one is the positive one, we said eidetic reduction. The negative aspect, Husserl calls it as epoche. again, this word is retained as it is in philosophy, but what you need to understand is this epoche. Let me try to type this. Yeah, epoche. Okay. Normally, in some books, you will find that in the last over the last T there is an accent. Okay, but that's not very important for us. Now, what is this epoche? Epoche is a radical elimination of all factual aspect. He also calls this as sometimes existential. Okay, now very problematic use of the term, but anyways, this factual is eliminated. It doesn't mean you have to completely ignore them. You have to completely make this fact into oblivion. No, it doesn't mean that. You need to keep this factual for a while at least in parentheses, in brackets. Why? Because if you don't keep this factual in parentheses, you will not get into the essence. Bracketing, this is called bracketing in English also, otherwise epoche is also called bracketing. Bracketing means, you put in brackets, right? So this keeping in parentheses or brackets, bracketing has to be done both on the subjectivity and on the objectivity. What does it mean? A phenomenologist must somehow put in parentheses, bracket all that factual information that he has, whatever the factual information is, historical, cultural, existential, all that kind of factual things, in order that he can arrive at the pure objectivity. Now, this is a very kind of looks very, it's a kind of fantasy in some way, to arrive at a pure objectivity. Now, the pure objectivity is possible to the extent of the purity of my subjectivity. Again, the purity of my subjectivity means to free myself of all the other factors that could somehow prevent me from getting to know the person. So, the purer the objectivity is, the purer the objectivity is, or the essences. So the phenomenology deals with the insight into the essence without any regard for the factual, or sometimes called also the existential aspects. So it is not the question of making the phenomenon appear in a factual reality, but to make the phenomenon appear in your immanent consciousness, which of course is real. So it is not that some kind of speculation or the dream. That is what is basically it is. Now, Husserl somehow realized he has to move beyond this. Then he moved to what came to be known as pure phenomenology. I'm not going to discuss that, because this whole question of pure consciousness doesn't kind of stand much value today. Finally, he has ended up becoming a little bit of solipsist. You see, in the beginning he was more in terms of this objectivity to the neglect of subjective. In the phenomenological period itself, it is a correlation of the subjective objective, that noetic noematic relation. But now here once again ends up in kind of pure phenomenological idealism, which would be, the ego becomes, the consciousness becomes the focal point. So everything is very, very kind of within your subjective world, what he calls the life world or Lebenswelt. This has serious problems, and people have challenged that, so we don't need to go into that. Unlike at least the phenomenology that where we speak of the subjective objective correlation, this has inspired people, whereas this one has kind of not very clear for many minds why he had to make this turn in some way. But be that as it may, definitely Husserl has influenced great thinkers, great mind came after him, including Heidegger and many others. There are many people who consider themselves phenomenologists. in the Husserlian sense of the term. And therefore they are very, they go into the essence of this and they analyze from a particular point of view. I think that I'll stop here and then we shall take up some questions for discussion and then we'll move from there. Thank you very much.